David, thank you so much for joining me today. I really appreciate it. For those of you who don't know David, he's a guy that's been on my YouTube channel multiple times, I think now. He's talked to Gruskin on Cracked Rackets. He writes for tennis.com, has a plethora of knowledge when it comes to the WTA. So
I was going to say a plethora. I'm
plethora.
so proud.
I'm trying to use bigger vocab words to make myself seem smarter than I actually am for a guy that's verified on Twitter. So it means
Don't make
so
me
much.
Blush, even though I'm washed out by this ring light, but I'm good.
Same. I look like I'm underwater. So I think the first thing, sorry about my setup, everyone. I'm at my girlfriend's, and as much as I love her, I just don't have my equipment. Totally fine. But we're here to talk about the WTA singles draw and what just happened with all of it. Because by David's reaction right there, you can kind of tell there was kind of a whirlwind of matches that we possibly did or did not see coming. And I think, David, if you were to describe this year's tournament in one word, what would you call it?
One word. Oh boy.
Yeah.
Disconcerting, to be honest.
Really?
I think the best part of sort of your post gaming of a Grand Slam is to be able to figure out what you've learned from it. And usually you're hoping to have learned new stuff and things that you can then project onto the next couple of weeks. And I think what had been building up until this Australian Open was this idea. And I discussed this with Alex Gruskin on the Break podcast, which is that we're getting this weird binary on the WTA where you're either getting Ash Barty winning the titles or a complete and total surprise. And that was sort of happening on and off last year. And for this final between Barty and Danielle Collins, you got that dichotomy right there in the final. You're either going to get the world number one or a complete surprise. And the world number one won out, and that's great. And she's clearly the best right now, as everyone will remind me and everybody else that's listening that she is the best player on tour right now. And I don't think my issue is that I'm looking for someone better than Barty. I'm looking for someone to be consistently as good or even a little bit less good, because evidently that might be even too much to ask for, a little bit within shooting range of Barty. And we can talk about the depth in the women's game, but even in the conversation about depth, you would still expect something of a gradient. And here there's so much, you're going to argue then there's so much depth that it's hard to really distinguish the difference between 2 and 32, which would be the difference between Sabalenka making the final and Danielle Collins making the final in this instance. So just to wrap up, I don't really know. It just seems like, if anything, the main thing that we maybe learned was that Barty has gotten stronger, that Ash Barty is mentally tougher than I even predicted her to be. The way she was able to hold up through these 7 matches at home, facing home pressure, down 5-1 in the second against Collins in the final, comes back, doesn't have a hiccup. That's an interesting thing to note, but I think we already knew that she was the best player on tour. So in that way, it doesn't feel like we learned a ton from that. But all in all, 3/4 of the way to a career slam, can't take that away from her.
You really can't. And I think you nailed it on the head there, because and this was going around on tennis Twitter with the idea that we are looking for consistent players on the WTA tour that don't have the last name Williams, don't have the last name of Sharapova when she was on tour. So it's fascinating to me how people can't wrap their head around. It seems like there's a concept out there that Barty still isn't the go-to player that people say to win a major, just because of not necessarily the publicity that she has, but just because of the amount of talent that there is on tour with her. Because from Osaka, who's won multiple Grand Slams already, Kerber's still on tour, she's won multiple Grand Slams, Kvitova, you have all these other names, but as of right now, in the last couple of years, it's just been Barty.
Yeah, I mean, I think from the end of the pandemic, we saw a really actually impressive Final Four, that first Grand Slam at the US Open, when you had Serena, Azarenka, Naomi, and then Jen Brady, who then backed it up and made the Australian Open final the next year. But since then, we're really seeing numbers 2 through 10 consistently struggle to make it deep at these major tournaments, which is why you're ending up with this dichotomy. If Barty were to have lost to Amanda Anisimova, it would have been a pretty wacky schmacky tournament. I mean, a great one for the Americans. You maybe would have seen Madison Keys making it a second major final. But I mean, it's a strange one. And you're just looking for the players that we kind of thought were ready to step up at the end of last year, be it in a Annette Kontaveit or a Paula Badosa, to then make that slam breakthrough. It didn't immediately happen. I mean, it's a bit of a quick turnaround from the end of last year to the beginning of next, but still hard courts. You were hoping that maybe they were going to make that push, but in the meantime, it's up to Barty now to take as much advantage of this landscape that she finds herself in as possible. I mean, this is a situation now where she can rack up as many as 2-3 slams this year if the rest of the field doesn't really wake up to what's happening. That Barty, with her seemingly unassuming stature and presence in the sport and game, is cleaning up, and it's up to the rest of the field to catch up now.
I totally agree. And you kind of touched on it, and we're kind of transitioned to it with the American success that we saw that doesn't have the last name Williams, because just to list off a few, besides Danielle Collins, who made the final this year, Madison Keys, Anisimova, Jessica Pegula, and even Haley Baptiste, who qualified for the tournament and ended up winning, I believe it was 2 rounds or 1 round.
I think it was 1 round. Yeah.
It was 1 round.
I think she lost to Maddie Inglis in the 2nd round. Yeah.
That's correct. So when you have the ability to win through qualifying and win your first round match, just as a young player like her, who has a lot of potential, who's been seen to have that potential to go to the next level, it seems like this was the first time that we saw on a consistent basis more than one American flag in the quarterfinal draw.
Yeah, and they're all fairly different personalities, different game styles, different origin stories. I mean, it's a really compelling bunch of Americans. I think my favorite among them, I think if we're looking for long-term potential, would be Amanda Anisimova. I mean, the fact that she's been able to kind of recobble together her career. I mean, you go back to that sort of sliding doors moment, Roland Garros 2019, Amanda Anisimova had Ash Barty on the ropes in that match, and things go a little different. Anisimova potentially has a very different career. Maybe she's the reigning Roland Garros champion for however long it took to actually hold the next one after the pandemic. I mean, this
2
is
straight years.
It's been a rough go for Amanda, emotionally, mentally, to then have to rebuild, and is slowly being able to do that. Had she not had to come out of probably the toughest section of a Grand Slam draw that I can think of in recent years, having to go through Bencic and Osaka, and then have to play Barty after this emotional match against Naomi, having to save match points. Can't imagine what kind of a difference that would have made for her tournament had she been in maybe potentially a softer section, had she gotten, say, a Sophia Kenin a la Madison Keys. But yeah, I think it's looking really good for the Americans. I'm excited to see where Danielle Collins can take this. You know, it feels like she's really reined in sort of the emotions for which she's become famous, and has been able to channel that into a really solid, steady game, and is becoming a player who could potentially replicate this. But now, along with 2 through 10, now with whom she now finds herself, it's up to her to now replicate it. And 2 through 10 is having a lot of trouble doing that.
It's amazing to me that she jumped 20 spots to make, she's now number 10 in the world. She currently doesn't have a coach. Her boyfriend was in the box the entire 2 weeks that she was there. And it's not the first time we've seen someone without a coach go far in a tournament. But to make a Grand Slam final without officially having a coach on your side is just another feat that Danielle Collins had to overcome in this whole calamity of everything.
Yes and no. I mean, I talk about this a lot with Grusk because he loves his stats. He loves his second serve return percentages. And they're great to hear. And sometimes they do contextualize why a player is on the run that they're on. But for me, at the end of the day, I tend to ask myself, or ask of the player, are you happy? Like, are you happy in life? And I think we're seeing, even what happened with Paula Badosa last summer, split with her coach, the man who was seemingly responsible for getting her onto this career trajectory. And you don't see a dip. And why is that? Because she's happy in a relationship. And there was no real emotional strife that she had to endure lacking a coach. Yes, she did end up hiring somebody later that year, but in the immediate aftermath, has a great run in Cincinnati, recovers from her shoulder injury, wins Indian Wells. I mean, so it's that kind of thing where, going back to Collins, she's happy right now. She's happy. She's feeling good on the court, doesn't necessarily feel she has as much to prove. Isn't that same desperation. And sometimes that could be demotivating when you're lacking that sort of main thrust behind your whole raison d'etre, your whole reason for being on the court. But she's been able to just redirect it into some really effective, efficient tennis. And that's what I think is most impressive.
I love how you mentioned the fact that there be a player being happy off the court makes them play better on the court, because it really shows the mentality and the state of which players are in, and what kind of environment are they really training in, and how do they feel about kind of going through this whole career path that not only affects them physically, but mentally and emotionally too, which I think is a great point to bring up. And that kind of brings me to that next segment that we have about maybe, I wouldn't say disappointments, but the ones that were kind of the quote unquote bust, in my opinion. And just to list some names for you, because these are the first ones that there are a few, but the ones that stood out to me was, and I think this was because of her last match that she played at the Australian Open, Svitolina was one of them. Sabalenka, obviously, because of the 102 double faults within 3 matches. Maybe Osaka, I put a question mark next to that one because I don't know because it was her first tournament back in a very long time and she lost to a very good Anisimova. And Raducanu a little bit, but we're still kind of putting her in an area where she's still getting used to playing main draw matches, if we can even say that, after winning a Grand Slam and having the pressure of being a seed at a Grand Slam now at this young of an age for her. So walk me through that list. There's someone that I didn't mention for that bust category.
Yeah, I feel like I want to push back on a couple of them. I mean, yes, Sabalenka has had a rough one this year with her serving. At the same time, like as she celebrated when she beat Vondrousova, I only hit 10 double faults today.
Yeah.
8 to 10 double faults is kind of, I mean, I really should ask Alex or somebody to run this number, but I feel like 8 to 10 double faults is sort of her average. Like even if she's playing well, she is throwing in quite a few double faults. It's it's when it gets to 18, 20, 21 that we're starting to think, and how bad some of them were, the misses that really kind of drove it all home. She had the misfortune of running into a Kaya Kanepi, which is the kind of match where if she had lost it last year and she was serving fine, I don't think anyone would have made a big deal about it. I mean, the fact that she was serving bad leading into that match or serving below par and then takes that loss, disappointing that the world number 2 was having these issues, because she was the one I was tagging preseason to be that player to just, we're looking for a rivalry, because I feel like there's a lot of sarcasm on Twitter about, well, you guys wanted a consistent number 1 and now you have it and now you're upset. And I don't think that's what anybody was really looking for in isolation. Yes, we want a consistent number 1. We also want a consistent number 2, 3, 4, 5. You know, you go back to that 2012, 2013 season when it was, I know, but like with Serena, Vika, Sharapova, you know, sharing the number 1, you know, splitting the number 1 ranking, sharing the slams, you're looking for that elite tier of players. And I don't, as cute as it is to say, 1 through 50 are elite, I mean, ultimately there is some delineation, otherwise they'd all be tied for the same number of points. Clearly some are performing better than others throughout the year, and therefore you would expect those players at the top to perform better at the slams. They're not. And going back to Raducanu, my expectations for Raducanu and Fernandez remain quite low, you know, just in light of the fact of the tournament that they had. I mean, even going back to what Craig Tyser said with the balls at the US Open, perhaps contributing to why someone like Raducanu was able to hit through the court as effectively as she was, despite maybe not being one of the most powerful players, and even the same for Leylah Fernandez. Maybe the ball really did impact their run there. But I think probably my top 3 disappointments, I mean, Annette Kontaveit, especially the way, I mean, she did get outplayed by Clara Towson, but then Clara did not win her next match against Collins, then makes the final. So it's hard to really say what happened there. Paula Badosa has a long match, nervy match against best friend Marta Kostyuk, and that kind of takes her out of contention for the match against Madison Keys, gets blown off the court in a match that I didn't really see coming.
No one did.
The most disappointment would be Krejcikova. Krejcikova, the way she's been playing this tournament, coming into Madison Keys, I didn't expect her to get blown off the court. You know, Badosa can struggle with her serve, isn't the biggest hitter. You'd expect Krejcikova with some more of her variety to have had a few more answers for Madison. And it speaks to how well Madison played, but at the same time, Madison was deep in a slam, and you kind of expect at some point there's going to be some drop off. She didn't really face that pressure against either Krejcikova or Badosa to really make her second guess herself. It just allowed Keys to tee off on the ball, and it was phenomenal to watch, but you kind of knew there was an expiration date at some point, and it came in the semifinal. And again, like, it's hard to be disappointed because that's kind of what you expect from Madison at this point. She's 1-4 in slam semifinals. Her one win is against Coco Vandeweghe. You know, it's a tough one. Yeah. So there were a few disappointments all around, but I think yours, you said Sabalenka, Raducanu, and there was a third one. I put Osaka, Svitolina.
What do you think? Because I thought in that particular area of the draw, it was a very reasonable way for her to battle to get farther into a slam, because this is another player that that we look for to push for that rivalry, and has been on tour for so long that we expected her to win slams, or at least one in her career, and she still has yet to make a slam final.
I mean, I don't really get tremendously emotional watching tennis anymore, but like my heart broke for Svitolina when she lost that match to Fernandez. She's in that third set tiebreaker. She's approaching the net, and I'm like, oh my God, like you finally like conquered this sort of defensive shell that you sometimes find yourself in these matches. You're going for it. And she just threw in like, either it was like a lame volley or a lame approach shot, and Fernandez just teed off on it and wins the match. And I don't really think she's been the same since. And when she was in the Azarenka section, I didn't really think that, I mean, Vika beat Svitolina injured in the Middle East last year. So I didn't really see Alina winning that one. I'm more disappointed by Azarenka for the way that she played through the start of the first week to then play as sort of meh as she did against Krejcikova. But I thought that's how well Barbora was playing. Osaka, again, are you happy? I think she's happy right now. I think she's happier, and I think she's able to see everything that's going on around her better. So I'm not disappointed. Maybe I'm a little bummed because I think I wanted to see that fourth round between her against Barty. We haven't seen that matchup since 2019, and that's, you know, when we look back on this run of Barty's form, like it's a fair question: is she playing players who are specifically tough or tough for her to beat? And so far, really, the question is no.
Yes, and I agree, and it's that rivalry that I was looking for Osaka and Barty and that matchup, because at one point, both of them were in the top 3, I believe, and correct me if I'm wrong, but that's kind of the rivalry that I expect going forward would have been more and more, I guess, happening throughout the year for these two to come against each other. And I guess after last year for Osaka, I'd say, is very tough with the whole French Open deal and the mental state of her. So I give her credit for taking time off and then coming back here and then actually playing decently and playing a tough Anisimova pretty well. I think that's the whole idea that I had behind putting her as not a question mark behind that performance.
No, I mean, for her, she'll be disappointed to not have racked up as many points as she possibly could here, because the clay court season's coming, and clearly that's been a bigger mental block than I ever gave her credit for. I thought that we've seen many big hitters succeed on clay. I did not know why she was making such a big deal out of it. You know, whether it was just people around her, just comments that were being made, sort of permeated her psyche, but certainly has Indian Wells, Miami, some really in Middle East. If she chooses to play the Middle East, I don't think she's playing the Middle East, but I think that would be. I would want to max out on hardcore tournaments if I were her right now. Just get as many matches as you can, and then feel as confident as you can going into the spring. But you know, I'm not.
No, I agree.
I'm not getting paid the big Team Osaka bucks.
No one is except her team, so I think you're fine there.
Except for Wim Fissette.
I think it's hard to go from Australia. A lot of players, I think, are going to Dubai right now for that kind of midway hardcore in between clay court season, and I think for her, it's the best to just, and like you said, to just keep pushing through that hard court as much as she can, just to kind of find herself back inside that top at least 50 spot, because she dropped to 87.
Yeah, she dropped like a rock. Yeah, a few of them did. I mean, that's another issue coming up in the next couple of weeks for who's going to be getting these wild cards if Venus, Serena, Naomi, and Sophia Kenin all decide to try to enter. Yeah. That's an issue where I think Kenin is probably going to find herself on the short end of the stick, unfortunately, because I think Osaka and the Williamses carry much more gravitas. At the same time, whether Venus and Serena are planning on coming back anytime soon is its own question. So I think maybe Kenin might not be struggling for wild cards.
That's a whole nother video that that needs to be addressed. And I think
on Patreon, only available on Patreon.
only for YouTube members. Thank you.
YouTube Red.
So, and I think to kind of wrap this up with two more things. Biggest surprises for me, Kaya Kanepi actually pushing through in a major besides upsetting someone in the first round is fantastic for her. Being able to get through that far in such a long career. She's been on tour the same amount of years as the second person I'm about to mention, Elise Cornet. I believe it's 16 years on tour and making it this far for the first time in their career. It's unbelievable. What did you think about Cornet and Kanepi's performance?
Yeah, Cornet definitely shocked me more than Kanepi, because Kanepi's made a ton of quarterfinals in the past. I'm almost inclined to put her as a bit of a disappointment, to be honest, because she really did have Iga Swiatek on the ropes, up a set and a break, was just out hitting her. Iga was not looking that great on court, was not feeling that great on court, mentally, emotionally. She's able to figure it out, and Kanepi sort of outplays herself in sort of a mountain of unforced errors. But I mean, the way that Cornet was able to survive that match against Halep, speaks to her perseverance, determination. Not the most physically gifted, not the most technically gifted. I mean, watching her hit that forehand against Simona Halep, I was like, I can see why she hasn't made a quarterfinal before. But I mean, just the fact that she was able to outlast her physically. And then in what was, I thought, the most heartwarming moment of the tournament, the fact that, someone who we maybe think of as being a bit, I don't want to say selfish, but just like a little bit self-involved, maybe a little bit on the court, was like thought enough to cede the floor to Jelena Dokic, who has been going through some personal struggles. I thought spoke so much about Alize's character. I've spoken to her a bunch of times. I've always had a fabulous time interviewing her. It meant a lot to be able to see her finally break through and make that quarterfinal. Obviously ran into an on-fire Collins. Yeah, but that was certainly a surprise, because I don't think there was anything about the way Alize had started her season that made me think this is the time she's going to make her quarterfinal. And then the full circle of it all, having made her first fourth round here and then making the quarterfinals a million years later. It's a great one. Great one.
It's like put in the SpongeBob 20 years.
Right. We're all out of time. We're all out of time cards.
The narrator got so bored. And I think for her too, it's funny because I was listening to her interview after a match, and she was talking about how she's writing a novel. I was actually quite surprised by that. She's writing a book, and she should be releasing it, I believe, in this year, actually.
Another book? And I mean, because I know she wrote the memoir.
Yeah, she wrote the memoir,
but in English last summer. Yeah.
No, but
she's writing a second book.
She's writing an actual fictional novel.
Wow.
Fictional novel. So I'm going to have to look into that and kind of review tennis players' books that they've actually written. Is there anything else? Is there anything else that we missed from the women's draw that you could point out, that in terms of, we get the thought of 3 through 11, the rankings, forget about those players. Just
because I'm just trying to think of like where we are right now in the women's game, and it feels like it feels somewhat similar to where we were in 2016 with Angelique Kerber, sort of someone like you wouldn't have expected to be sort of running the table, but it didn't feel as stark because you still had Serena there, and she was like trying to get 21, 22, 23, so it didn't feel as obvious. So then the next closest comparison I think I would make would be Martina Hingis when she was winning her slams at the late 90s, was just so much more ahead of the field, who still needed to learn and catch up and grow, and both similarly have very complete games, can hit a lot of different shots. And, I think that's sort of the closest comparison. But again, you were dealing with a Hingis who was not having to compete with, fully formed Williams sisters, a Jennifer Capriati who hadn't come back yet. So I think we're still seeing things. This post-pandemic landscape is really taking longer to take shape. And it's a little disappointing as someone who loves the WTA, because you felt like right before the pandemic, we were shaping up to, I think we were about 18 months. I keep saying we, even though it's no longer part of the WTA, but the tour was about 18 months, I would say, ahead of the ATP in terms of oncoming talent. And now I would say we're maybe a year behind, because now the ATP has your Medvedevs, has your Tsitsipas's, has your
even Carlos Alcaraz. Like you have the 17, 18-year-olds that have already fully kind of developed into that players that we're seeing consistently on tour. And the WTA now, we're still kind of seeing it with Badoza and Kostyuk a little bit, but it's not in Fernandez, Swiatek, Raducanu. We're seeing that a little bit, but we're not seeing that full-fledged consistency that we've been wanting, or at least what you're mentioning. That seems what I'm getting.
I want to start seeing them in more quarters and semifinals, because I think ultimately Barty's not having to play them in these rounds and is winning. And people will say, well, she would have beaten them anyway because she's 1,000,001 against them in the smaller tournaments. But that's almost kind of it's not the own that you think it is, because like ultimately the reason why those players are not like, they're losing the in the smaller tournaments. That's why they're not making it deep in the big tournaments. Like there's a correlation to that. So we need them to be good enough to be making it deep in the slams to then be challenging Barty year round. So ultimately, for someone who loves complete game, who loves variety, who loves sort of that human-like service, the way Barty, takes about the court, isn't dramatic, isn't theatrical in any sort of way, is bringing a very, and era of professionalism into this
Clean cut
this
tennis.
current. Yeah, there's nothing to really complain about, but
Exactly.
for someone who does prefer a little bit of spice and drama and contrast and rivalry, like that's really what we're missing right now on the WTA tour. And I tomorrow is another day, you know, in a couple of weeks, we might be saying things are radically different. And again, I do hold out hope, like you said, for your Kontavites and your Badosas in particular, because those were the newest. I mean, even Muguruza. I mean, Muguruza maybe was the biggest disappointment of the tournament for some. I think she came in maybe a little bit overhyped. Like when she did lose to Cornet, I wasn't stunned, but given how she ended the season as effectively as she did, it was a stunner that she didn't make it farther. But yeah, all in all, you know, a great tournament for Barty, great tournament for the Americans. Now it's up for the rest of the field to catch up.
I totally agree. And David, I couldn't ask for a better talk with you about this draw. I really appreciate you coming on again. It's always fun having you here. And if you guys ever want to follow someone that knows more about the WTA than basically everyone else that I know, physically and online, please check out David on Twitter, even on tennis.com. His articles are fun to read. So make sure to go check it out. And David, thank you again for doing this.
No, thank you. And if you're going to follow me physically, I encourage just 6 feet distance. That's all I ask. Otherwise, I'll take you right through the park of women's tennis. It'll be my pleasure.
I'm going to end the recording now. Okay. Bye, everyone.
Cheers.
Cheers.